In this section, we're going to be talking about the history of evolution. So we are going to talk about some key scientists who were involved in making some theories about what they thought happened during the process of evolution. We will talk about what exactly is evolution, and if you've ever heard of natural selection, what does that mean? So it's going to be a lot of vocabulary, a lot of concepts. So I would encourage you guys to start making index cards for these so that you can be ready for your quizzes and your tests. So what exactly is evolution? So evolution is a gradual change that occurs over time. And usually when you have evolution, you take something that was once less complex and it starts to get more complex as the time passes. So if we talk about evolution, not biologically, it could be the process of how cars back in the day, even if you think about in the 1980s, you have the car that might look like the one on the top. And now in 2020, 2021, you might have something that looks like the one on the bottom or even more advanced than that. So when we talk about evolution, though, in life science, we're going to talk about natural events. We're going to talk about events that changed the universe, that changed animals, that changed organisms, which are not man-made. So these evolution that we're going to talk about is things that occurred by chance, which is what theory of evolution is. Theory of evolution is talking about random changes that occur, things that occur by just chance. There's no man intervention happening. So part of the theory of evolution is something called biological evolution. This is when you have a change occurring from one kind of organism into another over a long period of time. A lot of people who think of biological evolution will think of man coming from monkeys or apes. But the thing about biological evolution is that if biological evolution was a thing, we should see more complexity in every single organism that we come in contact with. But that's not always true. We as Christians, we don't support biological evolution because the Bible doesn't support it. We believe God created everything by direct acts, by speaking it, creating it as they should be even now, and not because of evolution occurring. And another thing is that even if evolution were to occur, we would have to see changes in offspring as they are born, because if evolution means that things are getting more complex and more advanced as they, as time passes, we don't really see that. Even in humans, it's not like humans are getting another arm or are starting to develop superhuman abilities. We are still the same. We look the same. If anything that's evolving is probably medicine, but that's not affecting the genes of humans. So now we're going to get into talking about a few scientists and their theories and how those theories affect what we see and study as evolution today. The first person that we're going to talk about is someone called Lamarck. His whole name is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Since he was French, you could probably say that with a French accent. I do not have that ability. But Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, when we talk about these scientists, we will probably refer to them as their last name. So on quizzes and tests, if you can just give me their last name, that will be correct. You don't have to give me their full name. So Lamarck was, as it says, he was a French biologist, and he was working and doing his work around the 1800s. He came up with a specific theory called the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Make sure you highlight this, make sure you underline this, because you need to know these theories and which scientists came up with them. So what was the theory of inheritance of acquired traits? He believed that this was a huge part of biological evolution. Basically, acquired traits is saying that you have a trait that is caused, that an organism has, so a trait that an organism has because of the way the environment has affected that organism. It's not something that you were actually born with. So what does that mean? Let's talk about an example. The example that he likes to use was the long necks of giraffes. So Lamarck said that giraffes, once upon a time, back in the day, all had short necks. But there was once a time when there was a really bad drought that came and pretty much wiped out a lot of the vegetation. And the only vegetation that really, and most of the vegetation that got wiped out caused these giraffes not to have food that was closer to the ground. And so when this drought came and started to, affect vegetation, a lot of the animals that were a lot shorter than the giraffes and were closer to the ground, they ate all things grass and green that were very close to the ground. So the giraffes, they were left to fend for themselves, and the only way they could eat and survive was to stretch their necks and try to reach the leaves on top of trees. And so as they were stretching their necks and as they were reaching for these leaves on high trees, they started to develop longer necks over time, and their offspring started to develop longer necks as well. Lamarck also stated that you can actually, but first, before we get to the next example, the issue with the example of the giraffes is that an organism's trait that it acquires based on the change that the environment has on it, that's not actually changing the organism's genetic material. For example, if you're telling me that giraffes had to stretch their necks in order to get leaves and that's why their necks are long, that would mean that if I have pierced ears, my baby would also be born with pierced ears. But is that true? No, it's not. Or if you have a dad that works out and is super bulky, that doesn't mean his son is going to be born with muscles and a six-pack, right? Both piercing their ears and, having a six-pack while you're being born, those are things that you have to actually get done, like piercing your ears, or work out in order to be bulky. So how can this be true for a giraffe trying to reach leaves in high trees? That doesn't make sense. Lamarck also gave an example that there are these animals that are called shrews, and he said that, back in the day when they were first, evolving, shrews actually they look kind of like moles. They live underground, but shrews used to have a better functioning eyes. But because they spend so much time underground, they don't need powerful eyes because it's so dark that over time they started to lose eyesight, and they don't have very good eyesight. So basically Lamarck was saying that you can actually lose a feature if you don't use it enough or because of a disease. So there are a lot of issues with Lamarck's theory of inheritance because, like I said, even though your environment could affect the way that you maybe look in appearance, it's not going to change your genetics at all. So it's in your genes, it's not going to say, you have to have a long neck because you had to reach for leaves, or you're going to have pierced ears because your mom has pierced ears when she went to the mall on Saturday. That's not really how it works. So how viable is Lamarck's theory? Probably not as much. Another scientist that you probably heard of was, his name is Darwin. Darwin actually started off as a medical student, but he loved nature, and so he decided to quit medical school, and also the fact that he hated blood. Then he tried to go and become a preacher, but he was still not interested in that, so he had a lot of people pour into his life and encourage him to go and study science. So he decided to become a naturalist, which is somebody who studies nature. And he went on a voyage on a ship called the Beagle for 5 years around South America. And he would stop at different islands and he would start to observe the animals that he saw and compare them with the animals he saw in other places. So one of the main islands that you probably heard of that relates to Darwin is the Galapagos Island. So when Darwin reached Galapagos, he really liked the animals that he saw there. He saw that there was actually a bunch of islands off of the coast of Ecuador, and he noticed that some of the animals were different on different islands, even though they came probably from the same family. For example, one island had finches with really large and strong beaks because they needed those to break seeds or nuts that grew on the island. But on another island, he saw finches that looked almost identical to them, but they had a lot of a smaller beak because the island mainly had small seeds or fruit or softer vegetation that they didn't need larger and harder beaks for. So when Darwin returned to England, he wrote a book called On the Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And this book actually allowed the theory of evolution to become a lot more popular in that time. In this book, he talks about the theory of natural selection. And natural selection is basically saying that, over time, whatever is the trait that is best suited for that environment in order for an animal to survive is what is going to get passed on. There's a bunch of other points that natural selection follows that we will get into. But one thing about natural selection is that it doesn't produce new genetic information. So in order for biology evolution to occur, it needs an increase in genetic information that will then give you new living organisms. But natural selection does not produce new genetic information, so how can new organisms be produced? Doesn't really make sense. Here are the main points of the theory of natural selection. You will need to know all of these points. There are 6 of them, so make sure you have them memorized. Make sure you highlight the bolded parts that I have on the slide and make sure you pay attention to them. So the first theory or first main point for natural selection says that in every species, more young are produced than can remain alive, therefore some will die. So for example, if you are a bird and you lay 4 eggs, not all of those eggs are guaranteed to hatch and produce baby birds, and those baby birds may not all survive. Same thing with a turtle. If you have a turtle that lays like 20 eggs, not all of those turtle eggs are going to survive. Some of them may be eaten, some of the turtles may hatch, but they may not make it into the water. So you're always going to have more young or more offspring that are going to be produced and can actually survive because some of them will die. 2, the individuals in a species compete for the things necessary for survival, such as food, shelter, and mates. So there's always going to be some kind of competition in nature, whether it's for, seeing who can kill, if you're, a lion or a cheetah, whoever can get a gazelle or some kind of animal to eat are probably going to survive longer than one that is not able to hunt because, say, they have a broken leg or they're just able to not find food. There's always going to be competition with mating as well. If you cannot find a female or a male to mate with, you're not passing on your offspring to the next generation. 3, some individuals compete for things more effectively. So say that, there is an animal that is stronger, faster, they're going to have more of a chance of surviving than another animal that is not. 4, individuals that have the traits that allow them to win the competition are the ones that will live and reproduce. This process is sometimes called the survival of the fittest. This is a very important process to remember, survival of the fittest. This is saying some animals will have characteristics and traits to them that will give them an advantage over other animals. And so they will either kill the other animal that is not as advantaged or whatever. And therefore, the ones that are more powerful are the ones that are going to live. They're the ones that are going to reproduce to make organisms more similar to them. So the weaker organisms are going to die off and the stronger organisms are going to live and continue to reproduce. Number 5, individuals that reproduce pass on their traits. Obviously, if you have an animal or an organism that has really good traits that allows them to survive and compete, they're going to pass those traits on to their offspring. Those offsprings will continue to do so unless there's another competition that's better than them. And then number 6, only the organisms with the traits best suited to survive will be able to reproduce and pass on their traits. So obviously you're not going to have organisms that, you may have 1 or 2 or a handful of organisms that are able to survive because they're good at hiding, but then that's a good trait to have. But organisms that are not able to survive are obviously going to die off along with the traits that they have are going to die off. So only organisms that have good traits and competitive traits are going to be passed on to the next generation. So continuing with Darwin's theory of natural selection, he came up with something called descent with modification. For example, when Darwin talked about tortoises that he found on the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that there were ones with a notched shell, which is kind of like the one that you see up here. The shell looks like it's kind of caved back a little bit, allowing the turtle to raise its head higher. He found these turtles in areas where food were more higher. So in areas where they might have had to in areas where they might have had to get food from bushes or in elevated areas, he noticed that those were the types of turtles he found in those kind of locations. But he also found in other areas there were turtles with rounded shells because they had food that were closer to the ground that they could easily reach without any issues. So that's the difference between these turtles where they had to reach higher, so their shells allowed them to do that, versus these turtles that don't have that kind of shell, therefore they can't reach higher, therefore they had food that was closer to the ground. So that was one of the differences that he noticed among the turtles. Let me see if this works, hopefully. Another thing about Darwin that he also talked about, I guess it's not working here. All right. Is that natural selection is very much like selective breeding. Meaning that selective breeding is when you have a man that chooses the traits he wants and only lets those organisms with those traits breed. So for example, if you're talking about competitive racing between like horses or, getting the best kind of dog breed, you are giving that authority to a man or, a woman, basically a human being, that is selecting the best traits they want to show up in the offspring. And so they have control over that. So just like that in natural selection, the environment, Darwin said, is choosing the traits that they want to survive, not man. So man isn't being in control of it. The environment or nature is being in control of it. And so organisms that have the best suited traits to compete and survive will live longer and breed, which leads to a purebred group. So Darwin came up with, like I said, he said that natural selection makes organisms with similar characteristics. Natural selection also allows for something called descent with modification, which basically means that newer organisms are modified from the previous organisms. And he believed that all life came from a single form, and through natural selection, that's how we get new species. So basically, natural selection, we talked about all the characteristics of it, but natural selection also gave way to descent with modification, which allowed organisms to become more modified or more complex than the ones that they previously came from. And nature has a say in that, pretty much. Okay, so moving on and continuing with natural selection. Natural selection does not actually make new traits. It uses what already exists. New traits that changes the genetic makeup needs to happen in order for evolution to take place. So that means that natural selection is not evolution. It's just rearranging already existing traits, right? So if evolution means that you need to have new genetic makeup in order for an organism to survive and pass on, natural selection doesn't make new traits. It uses already what exists. That means natural selection cannot be evolution. It's just simply rearranging or reshuffling traits that already exist. So make sure you understand that part, the last 2 bullet points right there. Now, moving on from Darwin, there's another scientist named De Vries. And he had a theory of his own. His theory was about mutation. And the mutation theory of evolution that De Vries came up with basically said that he believed mutations could make the genetic changes that we need for biological evolution. So, for example, he saw that mutations in plants had a different effect about them, and he saw that it caused changes. But at this point, he actually didn't know anything about DNA and how DNA played a role in inheritance or passing on of genes. He knew that something was causing a change in the plants, but he didn't know that genes were carried by DNA. DNA is in all living organisms and is really what causes the changes. But he knew that there was something going on, and so he identified it as mutations that were happening. So anytime you hear mutation theory, always think about De Vries. Anytime you think about natural selection or descent of modification, always think about Darwin. And anytime you hear of theory of acquired traits, always think about Lamarck. Okay, now, talking about mutations, for biological evolution to take place, you have to have a mutation that forms new genes. Now, a lot of times mutations are looked at as a bad thing, but in this case, it can actually be a good thing according to De Vries. So there's a couple different types of mutations. The one is called somatic mutations, which is basically when you have a mutation, which is, mutation is just a change in a gene. So you have a mutation or a change in a gene in body cells. Okay, so this is like your skin cells, things like that. But they cannot be passed. Therefore, no impact is going to occur on biological evolution from somatic mutations. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. Somatic mutations, examples are skin cells, organ cells, also known as body cells. These mutations can't actually be passed from one organism to another. So it's not going to impact biological evolution. The only mutations that can be passed are germ mutations, because these mutations are the ones that occur in your gametes. Gametes are the ones that get passed from mom and dad to the offspring, and therefore only germ mutations can actually impact biological evolution. Now, with gene mutations, many mutations have to occur to make a new structure. So you can't have really one mutation and be like, oh, here's a new organism. You have to have all the genes being changed in an organism to make a new organism. So how can this happen with just a couple of mutations? That doesn't make sense, right? According to De Vries, he's like, oh yeah, you can have a couple of mutations to make an entirely new organism. Technically, you really can't. Now, mutations in an organism should technically cause them harm, because mutations usually are not referred to as a good thing. Sometimes they can be a good thing. But evolutionists believe that even though mutations were always known to cause harm, evolutionists believe that they can actually help to improve an organism. And scientists have been experimenting with fruit flies because they are able to reproduce quickly and have a short lifespan. And they would expose them to many things like radiation, chemicals that can cause mutations to see how it would affect them. But they noticed that they did not evolve at all, even though they were exposed to all these things that could cause these mutations. Instead, mutations have caused them to have kind of deformities. Like they had weird wings, some of the fruit flies had no eyes, they had deformed antennas, and they would die, they would not be able to survive in an environment. They would not be able to survive any competition. They would just die in a normal environment. So that was not really helping De Vries' theory that mutations could actually help cause a good kind of biological evolution. In order for evolution of organisms to develop from one single cell and then to see a bunch of changes occurring over millions of years ago, as they believe the Earth is, to what we see today, there has to be a specific type of mutation called gain of function mutations. So basically, gain-of-function mutation basically says that you would have to have, through evolution, new structures and new organisms that are developing these new structures in order for us to see a change in species. New genetic information, though, which causes new traits, are absolutely needed in order to see this kind of change in order to see new organisms being made. But scientists have no actual proof that this is actually something that's happening. They don't have any examples. They have nothing credible. There are also like gain of functions are needed, for evolution to occur, which is you're getting new, structures in an organism or better complexity in an organism. There's also something called loss of function mutations. Examples of this would be like albinism, which means that a person can't produce pigments of the skin. That's why you see like a lot of people who have albinism are very pale. Even their eyes are more of a red color. Hemophilia is also a type of loss of function mutation, which is when they can't actually form blood clots. But in order to have new organisms, in order for evolution to say it's happening, you would have to have gain of function, which we actually don't really see in our lives today. Today, many scientists are theorizing a new theory called mutation selection theory. So make sure you underline this and know that mutation selection theory, aka neo-Darwinism, is what scientists believe is the theory that's happening today. And this theory takes de Vries mutation. Remember, he was a scientist who says mutation is the one that causes evolution, and combines it with Darwin's theory about natural selection, where nature is really selecting what traits get passed on. And when you have this combination, you have a couple things occurring. One, you have mutations that are occurring that allow for new traits to develop. You have organisms that are producing offspring that are able to survive in different conditions and in an environment. And natural selection allows organisms that have the best traits and the most competitive traits to actually survive in order so that they can make new offspring. So make sure you remember and underline or highlight mutation selection theory, aka neo-Darwinism. This is a theory that scientists are leaning towards today. It's a combination of de Vries mutation theory and Darwin's natural selection. And the 3 bullet points: mutation supplies new traits, organisms produce more offspring than can survive, and natural selection only allows organisms with the best traits to survive. Those are the 3 points that support this theory. So, what are some problems with the mutation selection theory? One, I'm just going to read the bullet points because they do a really good job of summarizing. But the first problem is that mutations can cause changes, even if they're very minimal, to existing structures, but they can't explain the development of the structures. Okay? So even though you see these changes, they don't know how they're getting these changes occurring. Biological evolution by mutation selection theory requires a huge number of favorable mutations. So you can't have any mutations that could cause harm when you're going by this theory. And these mutations have to occur in the right order. And if you don't have a ton of these mutations that are occurring at the right order and at the right time and not in a harmful way, you are not going to be able to develop new organisms. They're not going to be favorable. And then thirdly, it also requires natural environments that favor these evolving organisms. So these organisms have to be in an environment that's going to support these changes, because if they're put in an environment that's not going to support these changes, that organism is only going to be partially evolved, or they're not going to survive at all, and you're not going to have any organism being developed. So for example, scientists believe that bats came from something called a tree shrew. But in order for this to happen, the bat's ancestors would have had to gone through a huge number of mutations, like they had to have mutations in their eyes, their ears, their vocal cords, their limbs, their organs, in order for a tree shrew in order to become a bat. So there would have had to been so many challenges that this imaginary animal would have had to gone through before it became a bat. And another thing is, if this was actually true, we would have to come in contact with an animal that's somewhere between a tree shrew and a bat at some point that they would have had to find in order to see if this was an actual thing. You can't go from a tree shrew one day to a bat the next. They would have taken thousands of years. And so we don't have any proof of any animal that's showing, oh, there's a change in the eyes, there's a change in the limbs, there's a change in their organs. We don't see any of that. We don't see the median, we don't see the middle part or the middle transitions happening. So how much time? Some evolutionists promote something called gradualism, which states that evolution occurs so slow that it can't be observed in one person's lifetime. So that makes sense. Other evolutionists have a different theory that is called punctuated equilibrium. So make sure you underline gradualism or highlight it. Make sure you underline or highlight punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium says that at certain times, evolution can actually occur super, super fast to the point where you actually don't notice it and it looks like there's no evolution that actually took place. But neither gradualism nor punctuated equilibrium actually solves the issues that are presented with mutation selection theory. So it doesn't really make sense. In your textbook, on page 170, I want you guys to take a little bit of time to read this kind of excerpt, and then we will continue with this video. So pause the video here, read that, and then start the video again. So in this little part of your textbook, it talks about intelligent design. Intelligent design, some scientists don't believe in because it doesn't support certain parts of evolution. Intelligent design pretty much says that living things are complex and can't evolve by chance. They believe that there was an outside force that has to have influenced this nature. So intelligent design actually gives way to maybe a god or someone, another being that scientists say have to have existed in order for these changes to occur. It just can't occur overnight, or it can't occur because of evolution because it's way too complex. This theory proposes that living things show such complexity that they can't have evolved by chance. And intelligent design supporters believe that there was an intelligent outside force at the beginning that was responsible for the design seen in nature, which is very interesting that they would say that, especially coming from scientists who believe so much in the science behind everything. So that's it for 8B. I know this was a lot of information. Make sure you are making vocab cards or index cards. Make sure you're studying your notes. Make sure you understand all the scientists and what theories they came up with, along with the examples with that go with the theory. Make sure you understand the mutation selection theory. Remember, it was made from De Vries and Darwin, and that's what scientists believe in today, because that's what your test is going to be mostly around.